my block and now the cops are stopping me. I said, what you doing here? Like, why you trying to talk to me? I said, officer, what am I doing wrong? Let me get just what I came for, I really won't be long. When I told him I had children, he was looking at me differently. Doing what I'm doing, why he gotta clench his fist at me. I came about the dirt, but they still mad cause of my history. I'ma keep on going to the top until they sick of me. Steady protest, but I don't even see a change. Always hearing BLM, but is it really in your brain? Gotta see what's going on, cause we ain't all treated the same. Why so serious? I'm furious, cause this is not no game.
And I'd like to welcome you back to NBWA, New Brunswickers Want Action. My name's Neil Clements, the real deal Neil, and I'd like to also welcome my co-host, Mr. Matthew Martin. Matthew, how are you?
Wonderful.
And Dr. Timothy Christie. Dr. Christie, welcome.
Thanks, Neil.
Excellent. We've been very consistent on this show in our discussion about the outcomes that we hope this show will enact. We've talked about the criminalization of racial discrimination as one of the outcomes that we hope for. We've also talked about adding Black history education to the New Brunswick curriculum. But our umbrella topic really and our primary discussion has always been about the amelioration of systemic discrimination by way of a whole of government approach, public inquiry into systemic discrimination in New Brunswick. And today's no different. These are the items we're going to talk about, but we're going to focus on systemic discrimination and how we can affect change in that regard. Dr. Christie, we've been talking about the concept recently because it's out there in the public stream and in the public consciousness, but we've been talking about the idea of all lives matter. And I know that we had discussions earlier about your thoughts on that point. Maybe you could share that with the folks watching at home.
Thanks, Neil. You're right. There's been a lot of controversy over the concept of Black Lives Matter, and I've seen some things online, some media posts, some articles even, that say all lives matter, and if you put a specific color in front of that statement, it's actually a little bit racist. And I want to first start off and say I want to take seriously the claim that all lives matter. The people who say it, I think, are genuine. A lot of them are genuine. Some are disingenuous, of course. But I think a lot of them are genuine, and they're genuinely saying all lives matter, not just Black lives matter. And I think where they're mistaken is they're using a platitude as if it's a meaningful statement. So yes, of course, all lives matter. So what would motivate someone to say Black lives matter? Well, we have hundreds of years of Black lives not mattering. In slavery, you cannot tell me that Black lives mattered during slavery. In Jim Crow, you cannot tell me that Black lives mattered in Jim Crow. With the police kneeling on someone's neck for almost 9 minutes until the guy dies, you cannot tell me that George Floyd's life mattered to that police officer. When Indigenous people are shot and killed in New Brunswick, you cannot tell me that their lives matter to the police. So when we emphasize that Black lives matter, we're not saying other lives don't matter, but we're saying, damn it, you have to understand that we matter too. And that's the point that is lost when people issue a platitude like all lives matter.
Right.
No one can disagree with that statement. But that statement doesn't account for why Black lives have not mattered up to this point. And that's why organizations like Black Lives Matter are so important, because they haven't mattered historically. If we look at the things happening right now, they haven't mattered, and they don't matter. If we look at the representation of blacks in jail, their lives don't matter. If we look at the way they're killed by police, their lives just don't matter. So that's what I would probably want to say, is that I acknowledge that some people genuinely say this, that all lives matter, and in their thinking, they're saying if you add a color in front of it, it might be racist. And I'm saying no, it's the exact opposite. By including Black lives in all this platitude, all lives matter, I think we're missing something.
Well, and I'll agree in that the reason that one of the reasons that Black Lives Matter originally was formed in the United States was in response to the ongoing and continuing murder of black men in the United States by police, right? That was the focus. So with that said, it wasn't all lives that were being shot in the streets in Toronto, Halifax, and across the United States. It was Black lives. So the focus of the concept should be obvious, just my thoughts. Matthew?
So here in New Brunswick, our Black Lives Matter New Brunswick chapter likes to focus on a few different outcomes. One of those is going to be the defunding of the police and the reallocation of funds to different services like mental health, addiction, housing, and really start focusing more on taking funds from the police and putting them into our communities.
Before we move on from that concept, I'd like to maybe elaborate a little more on the whole idea of defund the police. Because I think there are some misunderstandings in the general public about what defund the police actually means. And I know, Tim, you and I have talked about this, and probably you've got some more ideas about that, about defund the police.
I do, Neil, thank you. One of the problems is that the responsibilities and roles of the police have extended into areas that we might not need armed, trained police officers to do. So for instance, if there's a wellness check where someone's exhibiting symptoms of their disease, and if that person came into the hospital, we would not be shooting that person dead because they failed to follow our commands. The training of a police officer when they go there is to take absolute control and have 100% domination on the street corner or wherever it is they're confronting the person. And if that person doesn't comply, the way, say, Mr. Levi wouldn't comply with the police's orders, they shot and killed him. Not because he was hurting anyone, but because their orders escalated to a point where he wouldn't comply, so they had to use lethal force to kill this gentleman. We don't need police to do wellness checks. If I'm driving and I have a broken tail light, or my light is burnt out, and the police pull me over, this is an armed police officer who pulls me over, and now this person is trained to look and see what else I'm doing. And we can show pretty conclusively that black people are stopped much more than others. I would say we don't need an armed police officer to look at taillights. For instance, if he pulls me over and they think there's something else happening and they say, step out of the car, and I give them a bad attitude like, why do you want me to step out of the car? Do as I say, the commands escalate, and then people actually get shot and killed because of trivial interactions like this, for trivial reasons. We don't need police to do that. We don't need them to be looking at who's going through a stop sign. We don't need them to be looking at street lights. We don't need, there was one example of a police officer who went to a person in Tim Hortons here in New Brunswick, and the guy was in his car, parked at a Tim Hortons during COVID. And he was drinking a coffee and eating his muffin, and the police officer said, you cannot do that here, you have to go because someone complained that the guy was in the parking lot, and it escalated into something like a $1,000 fine. We don't need police officers to harass people in a Tim Hortons parking lot drinking coffee or eating a donut. That's not what we need trained police officers to do. So I think that the idea of defund the police means what are the absolute essential things we need a police officer to do, an armed, trained police officer to do, and let them do that because they could be very good at it. But all these other things is a disaster when we have armed, trained police officers do it. And that's where I would say defund the police makes a lot of sense. Not that we're saying take money away from them gratuitously, but they should focus exclusively on what the policing mandate is. And right now it's way, way, way too overbroad.
Right. And I think the St. John Police Force has a $24 million ballooning budget, and I don't know for certain, I'm not an accountant, but I'm sure some of that money could be used for some social services. Just my thoughts only. That is our thoughts about defunding the police. Now, Matthew, why don't you get in a little deeper? Why don't you dig a little deeper on what BLM New Brunswick does?
So taking a look, some other outcomes that Black Lives Matter New Brunswick has is looking at the deliberate omission of black history in our school systems. Right now, we hear a lot of talk about, well, I learned this or I learned that, but it's very sporadic. There's no consistency, which shows clearly it's not in the curriculum deliberately being taught, which is a big issue to us. That's a part of our history that is not being taught to anybody. That alone is our youth being brought up, our black youth. So we see that as a big issue and as a type of an identity crisis. Right. Thirdly, we're focusing on the complete elimination of systemic racism.
Matthew, I agree, and I think both of those points are important, and specifically related to the education point, I think it's important that children in school see themselves in the content. When they read the stories about the great people of history or the great ongoings of history, they should be able to see themselves in that history, and that's not the case right now for black and brown folks in New Brunswick. Now, we've also talked about systemic discrimination or the amelioration of systemic discrimination as a big focus for Black Lives Matter New Brunswick. With that, there's a lot of talk about anti-racism education. Now, when I first heard that concept, I thought, that's a great concept. You know, after further study of the idea, I think maybe it can be expanded on. Could you explain maybe what your thoughts are on anti-discrimination education? Absolutely.
On paper, anti-racism training looks great. It sounds great. But the problem with it is it doesn't really address the root issues of the problem. I recently wrote an article that kind of looks exactly at these issues. We see organizations getting funding and funding and funding to create this anti-racism training. But when we really think about it is, you know, we have these organizations who've been doing this for decades without really addressing those roots of the issues, which leads me to ask, you know, there needs to be a focused and a serious look at systemic racism. The anti-racism training, for whatever it may be, whatever outcomes it gets, it has its own purpose. But until we actually address the root cause and the underlying issues that are within systemic racism, we can provide all the anti-racism training we want, but we're not going to address the real root issue.
Dr. Christie, do you have any further thoughts on that comment?
Very quickly, Neil. One of the problems with anti-racism education is that it looks at individual behavior. So we'll say to an individual, here is how you can identify your own biases. Here's how you can interact in a more healthy way with other people. Here's how you could do things in a less racist way. And there's nothing wrong with trying to help individuals curb their unintentional, unconscious bias. There's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't fix the system one bit, does it? It doesn't save one life from being shot by the police. It doesn't improve health outcomes for blacks. It doesn't reduce the number of blacks that are going to jail or being incarcerated. So you can work at the individual level as much as you want, but it doesn't fix the system. And this is what I would say is one of the fundamental problems with anti-racism education is, once again, it's a platitude. No one can disagree with the merits of anti-racism education. It's wonderful to help people figure out their unintentional bias, their unconscious bias, and that type of thing. But the work BLM is doing is saying we want to fix the system, not just curb individual behavior, which is necessary, but the systemic problems need to be addressed as well.
And I think we discussed earlier when we were planning the show that it's not, so to provide anti-racism education, that's a rational process being provided to people who are racist, whom are irrational, having illogical thought, because racism is not logical, right? In this discussion related to anti-racism, I mean, we can agree that it's useful, but it doesn't create the outcomes that we're looking for relative to the amelioration of systemic discrimination. But talk to me more about what BLM New Brunswick is doing in that regard.
Absolutely. So we're very excited to say we're going to be working with New Brunswick Community College and the New Brunswick government on looking into what exactly systemic racism looks like. Currently, there's no benchmarks, there's no data or real numbers to look at to say how does systemic racism affect our black community members. For example, we wouldn't be able to tell you our specific education outcomes here in New Brunswick. We may be able to look at maybe, you know, what stands for Canada, but we don't know anything specific for New Brunswick. So what we're going to do is we're going to perform a study. We're going to create a task force that's going to look into 4 different sectors, focusing primarily on the health, justice, education, and our social development sectors. From there, we are going to start establishing those benchmarks. We're going to take a look at our health outcomes, take a look at our education outcomes, take a look at, in regards to mental health, our addictions. We're really going to start focusing and establishing those benchmarks where that data is possibly available. From there, we're going to start to reach out to our community members. We're going to speak to everybody. We want to hear from experiences that someone may have seen something in their workplace or something they may have heard in their workplace. We want to hear what's working in the workplace in addressing systemic racism, what's not working. We want to really be able to gather a report that says this is what systemic racism looks like for the black community in New Brunswick. Finally, we're going to finish off and we're going to target directly our black community. We want to hear from our black community of experiences that they've had with systemic racism, whether that's at work and they've experienced it, and they have addressed it, and that what came forth from them addressing it, did it work, did it not? So we want to be able to find best practices as well as what other organizations are doing to try to address systemic racism. And from there we can say, you know, we find this is working very well. We can help further that so we can have a very sound and comprehensive report that is going to say this is what we've discovered for systemic racism for our black community. These are some recommendations we have that can be implemented to help address systemic racism. And from there, we can start to look at our benchmarks and see where we can improve, and hopefully revisit it in a few years after the implementation of some recommendations and see if it's working.
Excellent. So your starting point then is to create some benchmarks. You know, Dr. Christie, again, I know that we discussed this earlier, but any further thoughts on that?
Well, Neil, one of the things, I'm not part of Matthew's study. I've read the proposal and the protocol, and I think it's brilliant. And one of the insights that the protocol has is that in New Brunswick, for the age of our province, from the beginning, no one's collected this data. So if you look nationally, we could say that in certain school boards in Ontario, for instance, if you're a black student, you are 14 times more likely to be expelled from school than a Caucasian student. We can look at arrest records and incarceration records and say if you are a black person, you might constitute 1 or 2% of the population in general, but you constitute 7 to 12% of the prison population. If you're a black person, your rate of diabetes is twice as high as a rate of a Caucasian person. These are really, really important outcomes that in New Brunswick we don't collect. If we can collect them, like Matthew's project is, then we establish a benchmark of where people are at, and we can identify problems. We can say, all right, blacks are not graduating high school at the same rate as Caucasians. Blacks are kicked out of high school more than Caucasians. The employment rate. There was one study I read that the unemployment rate amongst blacks with master's degrees was the same as the unemployment rate of Caucasians without high school degrees. So we can, this data, there are models out there in the country for what data to collect, but in New Brunswick we simply aren't doing it. Is that intentional? Is it unintentional? Who cares? The fact is Matthew and his group are saying we're going to actually do something. And I can only applaud them for that type of work.
As do I. And Matthew, I'm kind of curious because this is a big deal in New Brunswick. It hasn't been done before. What sort of feedback are you getting from the general public?
We've received both positive and negative criticism. Positive-wise, a lot of people are really excited about this. We're starting to really do something in addressing systemic racism. In regards to negative, we've heard there's a lot of groups that we're leaving out. And to that I have to say absolutely. This problem is not just something very minute, it is something that's very large. And as Black Lives Matter New Brunswick, we've decided as an organization that the information that's missing in regards to the black community is something that we want. I really encourage other organizations and other racialized groups to get together. This is a huge problem. This is just a small portion. Get together, put together proposals, and apply for grants to do this research, and team yourselves up with research partners, and to find the information that you're looking for, whether you're a women's rights group or you're a disabled group, an Indigenous group, our Asian community. Put these proposals together, because this isn't one small issue that this research program, this research project is going to solve. This is a very large issue that's going to take more than just this small project. It's going to take a collective effort from many different organizations focusing on their specific racialized group or their own identity.
So, if I might, I'm going to give it to you in a moment, Tim, but if I might make this comment, I would suggest systemic discrimination is a pandemic and we're all suffering from it, and not only you can fix it. So all those folks that are out there saying, let's focus on this or that other group, I agree with you. You're inviting them to do their own study, because you're studying the black community There can be another study for the Asian community, there can be another study for the Indigenous community, because although systemic discrimination is an umbrella, our experiences with it may be different, right?
Absolutely.
Dr. Christie, further commentary on that?
Yeah, so thank you, Neil. I think this is a really important issue. The criticisms that have been leveled against Matthew's project, I've read some of them online, and I've ignored most of them, so I'm not even going to legitimize them by commenting on them.
Right.
But there are some substantive issues that have to happen. So the first point I want to make is that racism is fundamentally irrational. It is not a logical way of interacting with other people. It just is irrational. And the reason I emphasize the irrationality of racism is because the people in power positions, or our government officials in New Brunswick, they have an expectation that systemic racism be addressed across the board. So they would say Indigenous people can experience racism, Black people can experience racism, immigrants can experience racism. Yes, they can all experience racism. But that doesn't mean any particular racist is a consistent racist. So you could be racist against Black people, but not immigrants. You could be racist against immigrants, but not Indigenous people. You might be racist against Black men, but like Black women. It can be all over the board. So the reality is that racists are arbitrarily racist because they're starting off from an irrational position. So when government agencies say, well, if we're going to fund a project on discrimination or systemic discrimination, it should include all of these stakeholders. And I would say, well, that is going to be a process that's untenable. The problem with systemic racism is so big and it's so diverse and so multifaceted that you can't have one way of addressing it all. And that's why what I really like about Matthew's approach is they're going to say, out of this huge problem of systemic racism, we're going to sliver off a small part and we're going to solve it properly. We're going to look at it, we're going to understand it, and we're going to study it. Now that doesn't preclude anyone else from doing this work. Other groups can get together and figure out how are we going to address the issues, or at least identify or measure or establish benchmarks for us. Now, I don't want to be blaming the victims. So it's not on the people that are suffering racism or the victims of systemic racism to fix the problem. That's the government's job, and they should fix it. And what they are doing, to their credit, is they've given the funding to Matthew and NBCC to actually do this small sliver of work on looking at the Black experience in New Brunswick and establishing the benchmarks. Now, that's just one part. They have to do it for all the others as well. And I don't think Matthew's group are stopping anyone else from doing this.
No.
So the point I want to give to our government people is you can't expect one approach or one study or one inquiry or one way of looking at systemic racism to address the issues for everybody, because they're all so different.
Excellent, excellent. And one, as you said, one size does not fit all. And we have different perspectives of how systemic discrimination affects us in our different communities. Because I know my experience is not the same as an Indigenous person or an Asian person, for that matter, or a new immigrant, because their perspective of systemic discrimination would be very different than Indigenous Black. And that's why we've got commentary coming back to in response to this very positive activity that you're going to be involved in, suggesting that, you know, it needs to focus on this or that area. And you know what? Those folks are absolutely right. It needs to focus on all those areas. I would agree with that statement. Matthew, Dr. Christie, I want to thank you both for coming to the show today, and your commentary was excellent. But to wrap up the show, any last comments?
Yeah, I'd just like to say we're really looking forward for our partners with NBCC and with the New Brunswick government on getting this project out there and starting it and producing these results. We're really excited to start embarking on it.
Excellent. Dr. Christie, any further commentary?
Well, I got a couple of thoughts. So people talk and talk and talk about systemic racism. This government has actually put their money where their mouth is, so congratulations to them for that. There's no downside to that. I think they're going to have to do a lot more, but this is probably a very good first step. And the other thought I want to conclude with is this all lives matter thing. I hope that throughout today, somehow we explain to people why Black Lives Matter as a unique entity is not a racist entity, but it's trying to extract out of our history why Black lives historically haven't mattered, and now we're insisting, damn it, they do.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Christie. So What did we talk about today? We talked about, as Dr. Christie just ended with, all lives matter. Agreed, all lives do matter, but as Dr. Christie had just suggested, what we're attempting to do here is to ameliorate that historical wrong, okay? And historically, black lives have mattered less, and you probably can't argue that point if you read a history book. The BLM concept, I think it's important to suggest and to state, Black Lives Matter New Brunswick versus what we're seeing on American TV, it's a very different environment here in New Brunswick, and Black Lives Matter New Brunswick is responding to our environment, not the environment you see Black Lives Matter affecting change in on TV, all right? Anti-racism education. Both Matthew and Dr. Christie made excellent points about anti-racism discrimination. We're not saying it's not needed. We're not saying it's no good. We're saying, what are the outcomes? What are the outcomes? We're not seeing the outcomes. The next thing we talked about is systemic racism. That's the point of our show. We're trying to stop the effects of systemic discrimination on the black community. And trust me, if we can do that, that will have a trickle effect into the other communities. But we invite you to take on the same activities that Black Lives Matters New Brunswick are doing in this study. Everybody should be involved in this work. We have decided as a team to communicate this message every week because we know that with consistency, somebody's going to start to hear and somebody has heard. That's why we believe, we think Black Lives Matter New Brunswick is taking on the activity, picking up the mantle to make some change here in New Brunswick. So I want to thank you for paying attention to the show today. And if you've got commentary about the show, or you've got ideas for the show, or you just want to reach out to us, contact us at NBWA at CHCO-TV. We want to know what you think. And if you've got some ideas about this analysis of systemic discrimination that Black Lives Matter New Brunswick is being involved in, message us. We want to hear what you've got to say. Thanks for watching. I'm Neil Clements. Make it a great day and choose to win.